Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, aka AIDS, is a spectrum of conditions caused by infection with the human immune deficiency virus. It is spread by unprotected sex, contaminated blood transfusions, hypodermic needles, and from mother to child during pregnancy, delivery, or breastfeeding. During the 90s, AIDS was one of the main diseases that caused millions of deaths on the entire world. From this amount of people, a 95% lived in undeveloped countries such as South Africa. In the 1980s, AIDS was diagnosed for the first time in 2 patients in South Africa, and since then, it is one of the countries with the most HIV/AIDS diagnoses in the whole world. 2/3 of the population infected with AIDS are Africans. The infection started being transmitted by heterosexuals, although there were a whole lot of different reasons why people could get infected. In South Africa, the main reasons why people were affected by AIDS were, first, lack of information and lack of access to health services. Second, people who do drugs because of the use of needles to inject them. Third, prostitution. Fourth, children infected while they were breastfed and orphans often at risk of being forced into sex have sex in exchange of support and become sexually active earlier than other children. Fifth, the low status of women and gender-based violence, which increased the number of women infected by AIDS. There is not a cure for AIDS. It is a chronic disease with an obstructive development. Antiretrovirals have been incredibly developed by drug firms during the last decades of the 20th century, which has required a great amount of investment, and therefore it triggered out the creation of patents.
The VIH was a huge problem for the South African population, since it was the cause of death of many people, and there was no treatment whatsoever. The US invested on research and development, and bang, they found a treatment for it. But for South Africa, this was still a problem, since the high prices of the US were not really affordable for their population. So what happens when a country like South Africa, which doesn't really have the resources to help the sick population? In the 1998, the policies established to what the patents concerns and the fact that nobody in the Western countries was even paying attention to what was happening in South Africa led to social discontent, which later on ended up being a social movement led by Zaki Ahmad and called Treatment Action Campaign. Under the pressure of the movement, the government finally decided to step back. And settle for the entry of generics from Thailand, since they could produce them cheaper, and this resulted in cheaper imports. And bang! Deaths caused by AIDS started decreasing. The US had all rights reserved, so they decided to sell the treatment at $100,000 so they could recover their investment. What would happen if there were no patents and the price were lower? Well, if patents didn't exist, then companies would not recover their investment, and in the end, they wouldn't develop drugs. From 2007 onwards, in South Africa, it was incredibly cheaper, $365 for the treatment. So why didn't these cheaper antiretrovirals go to the USA? Well, it didn't happen because it was a very regulated market. They couldn't access it. If they did, their investment would never be recovered. How does it affect the market? Well, at first, the US was dominating the market, working as a monopoly. Therefore, the demand was inelastic, just because the product was needed, and the consumers were determined to pay as much as needed to get it. Then, in 2007, South Africa managed to get the drugs cheaper from countries such as Thailand or Brazil, and the population could finally afford it. The patent owners from the US were not satisfied whatsoever. The demand in the US was shifted to the right compared to the South African one. This happened because the income in the US was higher, and therefore they could afford ARV. As they were necessary, the demand grew. However, the income in South Africa was smaller, so the demand was also smaller. We can see that ARVs are luxury goods.
In order to understand the research, we must explain what a monopoly is about.
A monopoly is characterized by the fact that instead of having many different firms that compete with each other in a market for homogeneous products, there is one single firm who has the monopoly on a certain product. That is, it is the only one producing and able to sell it, and therefore it can choose whichever price they find appropriate to sell said product. Now, I'll proceed to explain with the help of a graph how a monopoly works. First, we need to keep in mind that in a monopoly, one firm amounts to the whole industry, and therefore, the demand in the monopoly is equal to the demand in the whole of the industry. Second, in order to plot the demand, we take into account the negative relation between price and quantity, which creates the negative or downward slope. This is calculated by multiplying the quantity times the price. Now, we have the total revenues. Third, we need to calculate the amount of additional revenue that we get by selling another unit, aka marginal revenue. We must keep in mind that in a competitive market, the marginal cost per unit is the same as the price per unit. Whereas in a monopoly, the marginal cost is always higher than the cost per unit, which makes it non-profitable. The marginal revenue is calculated in the following manner. We divide the increase of total revenue by the increase in quantity, so that we get a marginal revenue curve in which the slope is twice of the demand curve. Then, to determine the monopolist's chosen output, that is, the point at which the firm maximizes revenues, we need to first draw a marginal cost curve. Marginal cost always looks the same, no matter what kind of market it is. It has a shape sort of like a J, but for the sake of simplicity, I just drew a straight line with a positive slope. After that, we equal the marginal cost to the marginal revenues. Their intersection will be the quantity sold in the monopoly. To find the monopoly's price, we follow the line of QM, upwards until we reach the demand curve. For that, one reflects the buyer's willingness to pay. This new rectangle created by the QM and PM are the total revenues. Having determined the total revenues, we now calculate the monopoly's profit. To do it, we must add an average cost curve, which has the following quadratic shape. Average cost times quantity will give us a total cost. The remaining of the revenues rectangle will be the profits. Note that if the average cost per unit exceeds the price, the firm will just lose money. In conclusion, monopolies are bad for society, since they create a welfare loss. Consumers are paying at high prices products that are produced in low quantities, while monopolists are enriching themselves. So after all the research we've done, we can draw two basic conclusions. First, for firming the pharmaceutical industry to start doing research on a drug for a specific disease, this one must have a minimum of potential buyers to cover for the cost plus some benefits, because otherwise they will not have the incentive to do so because it is not profitable. The second and last conclusion is that in case of extreme gravity, like the South Africa previously explained situation, if a government violates the exclusive rights of production that the patent bestows, it will be hardly reproached in international courts because the ethical factor will probably weigh more than the economic one, taking into account that in the exposed African situation, the price of the drug was continued to being paid integrally in the US.